The reason President Obama was in New Hampshire today was to talk about a payroll tax cut that he signed into law at the end of last year. Payroll tax cut giving the average American family about $1,500 extra they otherwise would not have. But that cut in your payroll taxes expires at the end of next month. The president today was arguing that it should be extended. Now, this is something that already exists. This is not a new idea. It is not a very controversial idea. I mean, on the one side of this argument, you have President Obama pushing for this thing today in New Hampshire. On the other side, you had all of these conservative groups, including the Koch brothers' Americans for Prosperity today, coming out in Washington and also saying, yes, please. We agree with the president. Please extend this payroll tax cut. So the Democratic president is for it, and the conservative groups on the right are for it. Where are the Republicans on it? Do the Republican presidential nominees support this idea? Hold on. In order to answer that, what month is it? The likely Republican presidential nominee, Mitt Romney, has sort of symbolized the Republican field by being all over the map on this payroll tax cut thing. First, he was for it. Then he was against it. Then he was back to being for it. Mitt Romney has made a hash of this issue.
Would you be for what he's advocating, at least for now, an extension of the payroll tax cut?
I'm all in favor of keeping taxes down and keeping burdens down on American businesses and employers. I want employers and entrepreneurs to have every incentive to open businesses and to start creating jobs.
If the payroll tax cut is not extended, that would mean a tax increase for all Americans. What would be the consequences of that?
No one likes to see tax increases. But look, these stimulus bills the president comes out with that are supposedly going to create jobs, we've now seen this played in the theater several times. And what we're seeing hasn't worked.
So you would be okay with seeing the payroll tax cut?
Look, I don't like temporary little Band-Aids.
Would you also support, when it comes down to it, an extension of the payroll tax cut?
I don't want to raise taxes on people in the middle of a recession.
So
of course
you're for
not.
it. But to clarify, you agree with President Obama the payroll tax cut should be extended?
I want to keep our taxes down. I don't want to raise any taxes anywhere.
So Mitt Romney was for the payroll tax cut in August. Mitt Romney was against it as a temporary little Band-Aid in October. And then in November, so far at least in November, he has been for it. The biggest news in D.C. politics right now is that the big congressional supercommittee has failed. One of the things that people hoped was going to be worked out in those negotiations was this issue of the payroll tax cut. Also, the extension of unemployment benefits. According to the Congressional Budget Office, if those two things don't get extended, it will have a huge negative impact on the economy. Since the supercommittee failed to act on those two things, there will now be the usual level of political fighting about those things, with the added spark that some of the combatants in these fights are going to be people who are running for president. Here's the thing, though. The election is a really long way away. The election is a year away, and we all have to live in this country no matter what happens in this election. These fights are not just for show. They are not just about political posturing. It's about whether the economy gets any better or if it gets worse. Forget the election. Today, we learned that the U.S. economy actually grew at a slower rate in the third quarter of this year than we originally thought. Instead of growing at 2.5% rate, we actually only grew at a 2% rate. At the same time, the national unemployment rate has remained stuck at around 9%. It's not all bad news, though. The economy is actually awesome right now for one specific sector of the country. Today, it was reported that U.S. bank earnings are at their highest level in more than 4 years. Woohoo! So at least there's that. The Occupy movement has got the country talking about the interests of the banks not always being the same thing as the interests of the country. And the Occupy Wall Street has got the country talking about the fact that the 1%, the very richest, them doing well, doesn't necessarily trickle down to benefit anybody else. The Occupy Wall Street movement have changed the conversation. And it behooves politicians of all stripes, left, right, and center, to be able to speak to those issues. And sometimes even to those individual human activists when they interrupt your speech. But putting your money where your mouth is means coming up with, now, economic policies that really do help the 99%, that don't just empathize, that really do help. Joining us now is Washington Post columnist and MSNBC policy analyst Ezra Klein. Ezra, it's nice to see you. Thanks for being here.
Good evening.
When Mitt Romney was against extending the payroll tax cut thing, he derided it as a little Band-Aid. Is it a little Band-Aid? Would it have a notable effect?
It is littler than it could be. It's funny because Mitt Romney's argument makes you think that he would like a much larger stimulus, right? The payroll tax cut, about $120 billion a year. Not nothing. Economic forecasters think that would be enough for 1 to 2% in growth next year, but not a ton either. It would be great to have more, to have infrastructure investment, to have an extension of unemployment insurance. If you think it's too little of a Band-Aid, the idea is to make it bigger. But obviously that has not been the tack Mitt Romney has taken with it.
In terms of what happened this week in Washington, Ezra, I mean, obviously people are headlining the fact that this was supposed to be a deficit reduction super committee, and they didn't come up with deficit reduction plans. And so now some automatic deficit reduction plans, some automatic big cuts are due to go into effect. And that is the headline here. But is it possible? Did other people in Washington expect that this super committee thing would have been able to come up with some ways to help the economy, not just to cut the deficit, but to actually help the way things are now?
Absolutely. Almost every deal that was seriously considered in the super committee included UI and the payroll cut, unemployment insurance and the payroll cut. And that was a big deal. And then when the super committee fell apart, the Republicans, much more so even than Mitt Romney did, began saying, well, we're not so sure about that payroll cut. We're not so sure about UI anymore. This was a really big deal, the super committee. You were going to get $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction one way or the other. There's either the trigger or the super committee. But you're not going to get the payroll cut and UI one way or the other. And you were saying at the beginning of the segment here that there are policies here that help the 1% and policies here that help the 99. And what's funny is this is one that helps both. The banks do not recover. Finance does not recover. Corporations cannot recover. Not in the long run unless the rest of the country recovers too. And so the market dived yesterday. And if you read the financial press, if you read Bloomberg News, if you read JP Morgan, what they sent out, everybody said it was for the same reason. Not because they're worried about the deficit. That wasn't going to change from what they thought it was going to be. But because they were now worried we would go into fiscal contraction next year because payroll and UI wouldn't be extended and the economy would be worse. And in the end, if the 99% aren't buying things, it's a little bit hard for the 1% to make money.
Ezra, we saw the news today that banks are having their biggest quarter in 4 years. I feel like this is obvious now. We've had record corporate earnings. We've had Wall Street, broadly speaking, doing great. Now we've got direct evidence that banks, as well as other big companies, are doing great. How is it that these guys are having such a great year? They're having such a great time of it, and it doesn't ever translate to everybody else doing better?
There's a lot of why they're not spending the money. Let's take the corporate and bank profits just that they're sitting on for a moment. Is it they don't see a reason to spend it. They don't see a way to spend it profitably, right? A corporation would hire more people, would build another factory if it thought it had people, if it thought it had customers to sell the new goods to, if it thought it had customers who would go and need a new store clerk. Similarly, the banks would give out more loans. They would hand out more investments if they thought they were going to make them back profitably. Similarly, if they weren't worried that the economy was going to crack up over Europe again next year, they wouldn't worry about having a big cushion. But they are worried about that, so they do. So there are essentially two big impediments to them getting that money out into the economy and helping the economy recover more aggressive than they have been. One is demand, which would be helped by things like the payroll tax cut, helped by things like infrastructure investment. And the other is uncertainty about whether or not we're going to have another major recession, perhaps due to something like Europe. That is also helped by things like infrastructure investment, the payroll tax cut, because at least if Europe goes badly, if we are doing the right things here, if we're doing some fiscal stimulus, if we have economic supports, if Congress and the Federal Reserve are committed to standing behind the economy, then at least they know it's not going to get all that bad. At least they know that our political system will respond in a way that will try to mitigate the damage.
Washington Post columnist, MSNBC policy analyst Ezra Klein. Ezra, thank you, my friend. It's nice to see you.
Thank you.